Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're doing something a little different.
Uh-huh.
Instead of digging into a research paper or a news story, we're going to explore critique. And a pretty fiery one at that.
Oh, wow.
It's all about a popular YouTuber named Café Kyoto, who has about 400,000 subscribers and makes videos in Spanish.
That's right. And what's really interesting here is that this critique isn't just a surface-level disagreement. It dives deep into some fundamental clashes of ideology and worldview. Using Kyoto's video, How the Far Right Stole a Friend from You, the construction of the event and radicalization as a springboard.
Exactly. And the critique comes from someone who clearly feels very strongly about these issues. They even claim that Café Kyoto blocked them from commenting on the video after they tried to engage in a debate. So you know things are going to get interesting.
Definitely. One of the first things the critic tackles is this idea of Café Kyoto being a false anarchist. They argue that while Kyoto calls himself an anarchist, his views are actually much closer to Marxism, particularly when it comes to economics.
So for those of us who might need a little refresher, can you break down the difference between those two philosophies? Because I think a lot of people might use those terms interchangeably.
Absolutely. Anarchism at its core is about rejecting all forms of hierarchical authority, including the state. There are many different schools of anarchist thought, but generally speaking, anarchists believe in self-governance and voluntary cooperation. Marxism, on the other hand, is a much broader theory that encompasses economics, history, and sociology. It criticizes capitalism and advocates for a socialist system where the means of production are owned and controlled by the workers.
Okay, that's helpful. So how does the critic tie Kyoto's views to Marxism?
Well, they point to a specific quote from Kyoto's video where he talks about an army of altruistic poor willing to defend as their own the patrimony of others. The critic argues that this reveals a belief in collective ownership, which is a core tenet of Marxist thought, rather than individual property rights, which is more in line with traditional anarchist thought.
So basically, the critic is saying that Kyoto is using the label anarchist, but actually promoting ideas that are more aligned with Marxism.
Exactly. And they go on to argue that this Marxist mindset, where an elite ultimately controls everything, it inevitably leads to economic problems that harm everyone, especially the poor. It's this idea that good intentions, even if they're genuine, don't necessarily lead to good outcomes.
And they seem particularly frustrated by what they perceive as Kyoto's assumption that all poor or working class people must naturally be anti-capitalist.
That's right. The critic explicitly states that they've interacted with plenty of people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who hold liberal views. They challenge Kyoto's apparent belief that economic circumstances dictate political ideology.
Now, this is where the deep dive takes a really fascinating turn, because the critic then launches into a critique of worker protections, something that Café Kyoto seems to support. The critic takes a very strong stance against any form of government intervention in the labor market.
Yes, and this part of the critique gets into some pretty complex economic theory. The critic essentially argues that worker protections, while they might seem to benefit some workers in the short term, ultimately harm the entire economy in the long run.
So break that down for us a little. What are the specific economic arguments against things like minimum wage laws or labor unions?
The critic's argument boils down to this. When you mandate higher wages or impose regulations on businesses, it increases their costs. Those increased costs then get passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices for goods and services. This can lead to inflation and make it harder for people to afford basic necessities.
So it's kind of like a ripple effect where even though some workers might be getting paid more, everyone ends up paying more for everything else.
Exactly. And the critic argues that this ultimately leads to fewer jobs being created because businesses can't afford to hire as many people when their costs are higher. This can lead to higher unemployment, especially among low-skilled workers who are competing for entry-level positions.
So the critic is basically arguing that these policies, while intended to help workers, might actually end up hurting them by making it harder to find a job in the first place.
That's the core of their argument. And they even recommend a book called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, which they believe clearly lays out the unintended consequences of government intervention in the economy. They seem to really want Café Kyoto, and by extension his viewers, to engage with these economic arguments instead of just dismissing them out of hand.
It sounds like the critic is coming from a very classical liberal perspective.
Yeah.
Where they believe in free markets and limited government intervention.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And this really highlights how our own pre-existing beliefs and ideologies shape how we interpret information and interact with the world, especially when it comes to complex issues like economics and politics.
Now, beyond the economic arguments, the critic also accuses Café Kyoto of being trapped in an echo chamber. They claim that Kyoto only interacts with people who already agree with him and doesn't engage with opposing viewpoints, particularly those of liberals.
Yes. And they see this as a sign that Kyoto isn't genuinely interested in exploring different perspectives or challenging his own assumptions. They even bring up a specific example: Kyoto's favorable view of Ha-Joon Chang, a South Korean economist who advocates for a more interventionist approach to economic development.
So for those who might not be familiar with Ha-Joon Chang, can you give us a little context on his views and why they might be controversial to someone like our critic?
Of course, Ha-Joon Chang is considered a neo-mercantilist, which means he believes that governments should play an active role in promoting their own industries and protecting them from foreign competition. This is in direct contrast to the free trade principles that our critic seems to advocate for.
So it sounds like the critic is using Kyoto's admiration for Chang as evidence that he's stuck in a bubble of anti-capitalist thought.
Exactly, and they find it particularly ironic because they argue that even Marx and Engels, who were fierce critics of capitalism, understood the importance of free trade for the development of the capitalist system, which they believed would ultimately lead to its own downfall.
So the critic is essentially saying that Kyoto's views on trade are out of step with even some of the most influential socialist thinkers in history.
That's right. And this leads to one of the most thought-provoking aspects of the critique: the question of what constitutes science. The critic seems incredibly frustrated by what they see as Café Kyoto's misunderstanding of how science works. They accuse Kyoto of relying on a postmodern relativistic concept of science, where facts and truth are seen as fluid and subjective rather than objective and verifiable. This is a pretty deep philosophical debate, but it gets to the heart of how we evaluate information and determine what's true.
That's heavy stuff. Can you unpack that a bit more? What does it mean to have a postmodern or relativistic view of science, and why would that be problematic in a debate?
Essentially, a postmodern perspective challenges the idea that there's a single objective truth that we can discover through scientific inquiry. It suggests that truth is relative to the individual or the culture, and that what's considered true can change over time. Now, there's definitely some nuance to this debate, but the critic's concern is that this kind of thinking makes it difficult to have a productive discussion, because there's no shared ground for evidence or reasoning.
I see. So if there's no agreed upon standard for what's true, it becomes almost impossible to debate or even have a meaningful conversation about complex issues.
Exactly. And the critic provides a specific example to illustrate their point. They claim that Café Kyoto dismisses the arguments of another economist, Martin Krauss, who critiques Marx's labor theory of value. Now, this labor theory of value is a pretty complex concept. But in simple terms, it's the idea that the value of a good or service is determined by the amount of labor that goes into producing it.
Okay, I think I'm following so far. So what does this Martin Krauss guy have to say about Marx's theory?
Krauss, along with many other economists, argues that the labor theory of value is flawed. They point out that the value of a good or service isn't just about the labor that goes into it, but also about factors like supply and demand, consumer preferences, and technological innovation.
So basically, Krauss is saying that Marx's theory is too simplistic and doesn't account for all the real-world factors that influence the price of things.
That's a good way to put it. But the critic's point is that Kyoto dismisses Krauss's critique, not based on its merits, but because he supposedly doesn't understand the nuances of Marx's theory. The critic argues that a good scientific theory should be clear and testable, and that it should be able to explain and predict reality.
So they're essentially saying that Kyoto values complexity and obscurity over clarity, which makes it harder to actually challenge his ideas.
Right. And to drive home their point, the critic recommends the work of Mario Bunge, a philosopher of science known for his rigorous realist approach. Bunge argued that pseudoscience thrives on obscurantism, using vague and convoluted language to create the illusion of profundity.
So this recommendation of Mario Bunge is almost like a challenge to Café Kyoto, and maybe even to his viewers to really grapple with the philosophy of science and think critically about how they evaluate information.
I think that's a fair assessment. And it brings us to some pretty serious accusations that the critic levels against Kyoto: intellectual dishonesty and censorship. They claim that Kyoto only engages with people who already agree with him or who can be easily dismissed. And anyone who challenges his views is labeled a Nazi or fascist, which shuts down any possibility of real dialogue.
Those are strong accusations. And it seems like the critic feels personally targeted because they claim that Kyoto blocked them from commenting after they tried to engage in a respectful debate about economic and political theory.
Yes, and they highlight what they perceive as a major irony. Café Kyoto seems to exhibit the same behaviors that he criticizes in others: like radicalization, justifying violence, and refusing to engage in meaningful debate.
So the critic is basically saying you're accusing others of the very things you're guilty of.
Exactly. And they also point out what they see as manipulative tactics in Kyoto's video, specifically his use of imagery and language to link liberalism with the far right, even though historically liberalism has often been seen as a counterforce to authoritarianism and extremism.
That's an important point because it gets to the heart of how information can be used or misused to shape public opinion and influence political discourse.
Absolutely. And the critic brings up some pretty heavy historical examples, like Lenin and Goebbels, masters of propaganda, to make the point that manipulating information for political ends is not unique to any one ideology. It's a tactic that's been used throughout history, and it's something we need to be aware of, especially in today's world of social media and online information overload.
So it's like they're saying, don't fall for the easy narratives or the simplistic labels. Think critically about the information you're consuming and the sources it's coming from.
Precisely. And this leads us to the critic's final point, which is the allure and the danger of ideology. They express concern that Café Kyoto's strong ideological leanings are blinding him to alternative perspectives. And they observe that Kyoto's ideology seems to permeate every aspect of his life. His friendships, his social circles, even his work.
So they're basically saying that Kyoto is so deeply entrenched in his ideology that it's become his entire identity, which makes it almost impossible for him to see the world through a different lens.
That's a good summary.
Yeah.
And they make a poignant observation that being left-wing has become a kind of identity for Kyoto, something cool and trendy, a way of life. They seem to be suggesting that this identification with a particular ideology can make it even harder to be objective and open-minded.
It's almost like they're saying that ideology has become a substitute for critical thinking, a prepackaged set of beliefs that people adopt without really questioning or examining them.
That's an interesting interpretation. It makes you wonder, how much does our own identity, our sense of self, get tied up in our political and ideological beliefs? And how does that affect our ability to engage in meaningful dialogue with people who hold different views?
It's a really important question, and I think it's something we all grapple with, especially in today's polarized political climate. It's so easy to get caught up in the us versus them mentality and to demonize those who disagree with us.
Absolutely. And the critic makes a point of highlighting what they see as Kyoto's tendency to only engage with normies, people who they perceive as less knowledgeable about political theory. In an attempt to radicalize them towards his left-wing ideology, they seem to be suggesting that Kyoto is afraid to engage in genuine debate with people who are well-versed in political and economic theory, because he knows his arguments wouldn't hold up under scrutiny.
So it's like they're saying you're picking easy targets to preach to rather than actually engaging in a real intellectual exchange with people who might challenge your views.
That's a fair interpretation. And they also make a point of highlighting the common ground between fascism and socialism, particularly in their economic policies, which often involve nationalism, protectionism, and heavy government intervention. This is a key point because it challenges the traditional left-right political spectrum, suggesting that there are more similarities between these dreams than many people realize.
That's really interesting because we often think of fascism and socialism as being on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but you're saying that they actually share some key characteristics, at least when it comes to their economic policies.
Exactly. And the critic even goes so far as to say that liberalism is the opposite of both fascism and socialism, placing it on a completely different axis. This is a provocative claim, and it forces us to rethink how we categorize and understand different political ideologies.
It's like they're saying that the traditional left-right spectrum is too simplistic to capture the complexities of political thought, and that we need to move beyond these binary categories if we want to have more nuanced and productive conversations about politics.
I think that's a really important insight. And ultimately, the critic concludes that Café Kyoto is more interested in being a sect leader than a free-thinking anarchist. They challenge him to engage in a debate with someone intelligent and informed, seemingly confident that such a debate would expose the flaws in Kyoto's arguments.
It's a powerful call to action, a plea for Café Kyoto to step outside his echo chamber and engage in genuine intellectual discourse. It's like they're saying, put up or shut up. If you're so confident in your ideas, then defend them in a fair and open debate.
And this brings us back to a point we touched on earlier, the importance of engaging with diverse viewpoints and being open to challenging our own assumptions.
It's so easy to get trapped in our own ideological bubbles, surrounded by people who only reinforce our existing beliefs. But this critique shows us that real intellectual growth often comes from those tough conversations with people who see the world differently than we do.
It's a reminder that true intellectual humility means acknowledging that we could be wrong and that our understanding of the world is always evolving. There's always something new to learn.
This deep dive has been fascinating. It's amazing to see how these abstract ideas about economics, philosophy, and ideology play out in something as seemingly mundane as the comment section of a YouTube video.
It makes you think. If Café Kyoto responded to this critique, how would he approach it? Would he dig in and defend his views, or be open to considering other perspectives?
That's the question, isn't it? And it speaks to a bigger challenge we face as a society. How to have productive and respectful conversations with people who hold different views than our own. It's easy to just dismiss them and label them and move on.
But this critique shows that even the most passionate criticism can offer valuable insights, things that challenge our own thinking and help us see the world from a new angle. The key is being willing to listen to truly engage with the arguments and consider that we might learn something new, even from those we disagree with.
That's a powerful takeaway. It's not about agreeing with every single point the critic makes, but about appreciating the value of diverse perspectives, even those that might initially make us uncomfortable.
It also reminds us that behind every piece of content we see online, there's a human being with their own experiences, beliefs, and motivations. It's easy to forget that in the fast-paced world of online debates.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave you with a final thought. If you were in Café Kyoto's shoes, how would you respond to this critique? Would you welcome a debate or dismiss it outright? What would influence your decision?
It's definitely something to think about. Maybe it'll even spark some interesting conversations offline.
Thanks for joining us on this journey, exploring online criticism and clashing worldviews. Until next time, keep diving deep.